Busy is good. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today is what we're talking about is the modern tech candidate, or how do you basically go through the talent assessment when it comes to the modern tech candidate. And the reason I said modern, you may want to think about it slightly differently in terms of after ChatGPT, before ChatGPT, or after Gen AI became so viral, right? So that's basically the conversation about. I'd quickly want to just go round robin, so all of you can introduce yourself, and then maybe moderate this conversation. Let's just keep it free flowing. Whatever comes to your mind, whatever insights you can share, that we can then later on share with our audience as well. Perfect. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
Cool.
Yeah.
Josie, I might want to start with you, please.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to be here. So I'm Josie Haynes. I am currently a women in tech leadership coach and advisor for tech companies. I left my corporate world in July of 2022 after 23 years in tech. My focus has been working on large scale consumer technologies at companies like Zynga and Apple and Tile and American Express. And my most recent role was VP of Software Engineering as well as Head of DEI at Tile.
Thank you. Quentin?
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer at ArtNet. And what I'm doing there is building data services and overhauling the technology platform. I came on 2 years ago, and we made some pretty drastic changes to the engineering team and implemented Agile and really are now over the past 2 years have cranked out a lot of work and finally seeing the fruits of our labor succeed. But before that, I spent 13 years in finance at IHS Markit, and during that time, the division I worked for was basically like a agency within the financial world, and so we're kind of our department was kind of the original fintech. And so what we built was brokerage solutions and wealth management solutions. And so very familiar with financial data, and it was a pretty exciting time, but decided to move on and pursue some other things.
And correct me if I'm wrong, even at ArtNet, there is a bit of element of the financial world as well, right? Because there's a whole bunch of
And that's kind of what and that's kind of what attracted me, was this confluence of art as an asset class or an investment, and then the NFT and crypto side was really taking off, and then just art in itself was pretty interesting, and it's really interesting to see the melting pot that's happening within the art world right now. So yeah.
Thanks. Avinash?
Hi, this is Avinash. I am CEO and co-founder of BarRaiser. So here at BarRaiser, I've been working with building product and technology teams, along with planning for product and technology and every other thing. Before that, I've spent more than 15 years now in building technology and product. Firstly, as a CTO of now a very scaled food delivery system, and then also worked with building technology and product teams and technology and product for a social network that I founded before BarRaiser.
Thank you. So I'll kick it off, and maybe just start with the whole idea of evolution of hiring with AI. Right now, when we think about how generative AI has changed or started to change different aspects or different roles across the entire business value chain, how do you see it affecting hiring, and to be more specific, tech hiring? so far and going forward, both? Josie, you want to take a dig at that?
Sure. So, I think, and it's obviously not just been since ChatGPT came out that AI has been attempted to be used for hiring, right? I think Amazon in the late 2010s actually attempted to create an AI service to actually help process its job look through resumes, and it actually turned out they stopped the project because it turned out to be biased against women, right? And so, AI has not, while it's taken off in the last year, it's not just something that has just come into play. And I think AI can actually help reduce bias, but it's about how do we train these things effectively, right? And I think the places that we can really be using AI effectively right now is to help in doing things like scheduling, potentially, automating, creating the job descriptions, even helping create the interview plans and ensuring that we're creating effective assessments. But we still need the human aspect to ensure that we're doing things properly. And I think also it's so much of the data set, right? Because going back to the bias in against women in the first case I mentioned, it happened to be that the data set was trained on primarily male resumes, right? And so you have to be careful to see, like, hey, what are the models learning from these things?
And just for the context of this conversation, I think none of us here actually believe that AI can do the hiring all by itself.
Yep.
So when we talk about AI, it's primarily about AI being an enabler than being the decision maker or the running the function all by itself. But that's a very valid
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, this is where BarRaiser can really actually be helpful there, right? Is, we get recency bias, for example, as humans. And so having something that actually processes our interviews and actually parses out the different answers so that when we are looking at the feedback, we can actually go back to them, can actually really help reduce the bias in the final feedback process. And so I think it's using technology in ways like that where AI can be really powerful.
Thank you. Quentin, what are your thoughts about it?
I think Josie just about covered it all. But what's interesting is I can see AI helping end to end with everything, whether it's the skill set development for the engineers, even to writing the resume. Obviously, what's interesting is the other day I put my name in ChatGPT to see what would come up, and of course it uses Bing to go do a search, and what it found was like an old resume on GitHub that I had put on there, and it didn't really search LinkedIn, which was kind of interesting, but I think it, from an AI perspective, I think it could help in the discovery of new talent, and then and hopefully eliminate some of that bias as well. I mean, when we think about the tech industry, it's not just women, but I think there's a problem overall with diversity, and it's really even before pre-COVID, you had to be like in those communities and find those people that were like minorities or whatnot. Now I think we're able to search the data set across the globe essentially to find talented people. And then I even think that AI could actually, it doesn't even need to be a process where people submit their resumes anymore. It's like AI can actually go out and find those people for us, and maybe create the initial connection with them and then draw them in. And then from there, you can kind of go through that pool of talent But yeah, I think when I was at IHS Market, one of the frustrating things was not being, one of the big four in tech and having a limited talent pool. So the department I worked at was based out of Boulder, and there was, we were competing with the technology companies that were here within the community, like Google and Microsoft and whatnot. And soon as we got permission to hire remote developers, all of a sudden our talent pool became a lot bigger, which was amazing. And so, with AI, going back to what I said, I think just being able to search across the globe and find those, individuals will be huge. But,
Interesting. And both of you, to a certain extent, spoke about bias or diversity. And I will definitely want to come back to that. But there's one question, and I'll start with Avinash, but I'd like all of you to chip in. Now, this is coming from personal experience of what we see here at BarRaiser, right? There's a lot of cases where, well, not a lot of cases, but there are quite a few of our clients that are always worried about candidates trying to use ChatGPT during an interview. And maybe I'm not very well educated when it comes to that, but do you think that's really a bad thing, considering how prevalent it's going to be as we go ahead, especially in helping us do those tasks which are, relatively mundane?
I think, Manav, let me just take from the last point.
Yeah.
I think resumes are also, there's an interesting point is after ChatGPT, before ChatGPT, basically, only companies could have a lot, access to a lot of AI. But after ChatGPT, it's so also because of its popularity. Now everyone has access and awareness of what ChatGPT can do. So a lot of resumes are now getting created, personalized based on what is the role, what are the requirements, using ChatGPT as well. So it's kind of becoming like AI versus AI on creating resume versus filtering resume, and
right.
and it's going to, I don't know if how at some point I think resumes are actually dead, and more will be about as Quentin was saying about data getting mined for you from various parts, and then signals from GitHubs or your past projects, etc., and then combining all of those with your background, etc., and then maybe some screening rounds to actually now screen. Using resume for that is getting really, really difficult. Right. Second, as you said, that's my view. Secondly, using ChatGPT, I think as we go forward, it will be like becoming like a calculator for creating code. So a lot of, I think it's going to be a continuous debate, because a lot of exams allow calculator, a lot of exams do not allow calculator, during exam points. So it will be interesting to see where the world goes. But surely there should be some new tests or new ways of interviews to be developed, which actually can, we can see how good a candidate is in using these tools and then solving real world problems. I think that would be very interesting.
And what about you, Quentin? Like, when you hire for your team, do you consider some of this aspects as to, I want to know if the candidate has sort of cheated using ChatGPT? I'm using air quotes because I don't know if this is actually cheating or not. Because eventually,
yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, it's more, for me, it's always about the things on their resume and what they did. And I tend to be like, when I'm looking for a specific person, like I can tell if they've written, data pipelines or whatever. And, I had one candidate who said he had done some work for UBS, and we talked through it, and you can tell he knew what he was talking about. So I don't, I guess if it's, like a critical thinking question and it's related to, writing code or something, or like solve bubble or write bubble sort for me or something like that, then I think that's where people be able to use Chat GPT to game the interview. But overall, I don't really have an issue with it. One of the interesting things that, and whether or not we were supposed to or not, but at one of the former firms I worked for, we would have people actually write code in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you'd have like basically a list of questions, and depending on, the type of engineer you were, you'd get the questions tailored to you, and you actually had to solve, function or write functions or solve problems right in front of us. And I think what was interesting is like sitting, and this was mainly in person, but sitting with somebody in the room and having them be at the keyboard really told you a lot about, what their skill sets look like. So, and then obviously with the pandemic, that's not as, or a lot of with remote work, that's not as big of a thing. But I think it really comes down to someone's comfortability with tech in general. And then, and yeah, I mean, people have GitHub Copilot now, and you would expect your engineers to use those tools because they're saving you money, right? And so I don't necessarily have an issue with it.
Interesting. And just to build on that, right? Considering that now the hard skills part of the job is going to get easier, and I'm just taking a big assumption here. The focus when trying to evaluate a tech candidate is going to get more towards some of the behavioral aspects, and there is very interesting data on how, especially on the tech side, how companies are hiring candidates, even the ones who sort of do not cross the threshold or haven't performed very well on the behavioral aspects. But Josie, do you see that becoming more and more relevant? I mean, it is quite relevant, but it's becoming more relevant to assess candidates on the behavioral aspects than the hard skills of whether you can code or not.
Yeah, and I actually think this kind of intertwines a little bit to your last question too, around like, hey, using tools and things like that, right? And I think, again, these AI tools at the current point in time are not replacements for software engineers. They are enhancing their ability. And so you get a good senior software engineer using Copilot, and they are going to be able to use that effectively and know whether the code it's producing is great or it needs to be tweaked, because the senior software engineer still understands the fundamentals of like, this is how to build a scalable solution. This is how frameworks should look like, things like that. You put the same junior engineer in front of Copilot and have it try to create the same code, and they might actually fail massively and create something that's completely non-scalable because they don't actually understand kind of how the software should be built. And so I think focusing more on having interviews assess, okay, do you understand like what is a good architecture? How do you want to design these things? Is going to actually be one of the more crucial things that we need to figure out how to be effectively evaluating folks in. And I think system design interviews tend to be a great place for this for more senior folks, for example. I always personally think behavioral interviews and skills, kind of going back to the question you asked me, are crucial, right? I think we do end up, both promoting and hiring folks right now who are not always the strongest on this side because they were like, oh my gosh, but they're such a great engineer. And, I'm not sure that goes away with the AI, because you still obviously need great engineers who understand the large scale architectures. But I do believe it's going to be so much more crucial in, if you, again, want to be creating more diversity and inclusion in this industry, you need to be creating spaces where there's psychological safety and, and I mean, the research shows this, right? Like if we have good psychological safety. We build inclusive teams. We actually build better products. Companies are more likely to thrive in the recession, right? Like the data is all there. And so we need to realize at some point that, yes, it is an important thing to focus on. But yeah, I did want to comment on the fact that, I think it's not just the soft skill side. It's also kind of that, how do you evaluate that higher level thinking and analysis, which at least at this point, you can't just type into ChatGPT and get a quick answer back, I think, to answer an interview question and the time that it would take to do that right now. So
you could ask Dolly to draw you a system diagram.
Yeah.
So I would then assume that, or maybe what I'm hearing is that whiteboarding interviews, or basically evaluation where you actually whiteboard or try and solve a problem with the candidate, are going to be more prevalent than maybe just leaving them with a code to complete, or a problem, and let them take over, dig at that, just code as soon as possible, etc. Is that something that is going to be a better way to evaluate candidate as we go in the future?
I don't know about whiteboarding per se. I think there's a lot, like, that's not what you naturally are doing anyways, right? As an engineer, you do sit in front of a computer with tools, right? I think a great way to analyze like skills is give folks a code review, right? Give a small contained piece of a code base and that has some bugs in it. Say, hey, there are some bugs in this, and have them analyze that code. Or do a pair programming exercise where you're giving a small problem set and say like, hey, let's add a feature to this, and how would you think about it? Like, where do you think you'd see the scaling issues? Like, I think the closer we can get the interviews to what people are actually doing in a day-to-day, and not just be trying to say like, yeah, can you write a bubble sort? Yeah, no, you can just ask ChatGPT. You'll get the code back from that in like seconds. And like, that's not helping anybody, right? But again, this isn't also kind of a new problem. People could Google answers during remote interviews too, prior to chat, right? Not quite as efficient, right? But it's still the same thing. Evaluating for these tech roles is hard. And the roles themselves, as the technology evolves, is also going to change too. What a software engineer does in 5 years, I believe, is going to look very different from what a software engineer does today.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's a good point about Google is, most of the interviews we would do, we'd be like, you can use Google if you want. So, because it's naturally part of the process. If you don't know something, then you go to Google to look it up. So
makes sense. Coming back to the softer skills part, right? And the reason I'm sort of dwelling upon this is also because to my earlier point, I've seen a lot of candidates, especially in tech, making it through even when they're not doing so well on the behavioral aspect of the softer sides, softer skills. Maybe Avinash, you can talk about a little bit on how AI can help in assessing these interviews better. And I'm not just talking about, the candidate itself, because I guess at some point in time, the interviewers are also not doing the softer skill assessment as well as the the technical skills assessment.
yeah, I think we lost him. So
no worries. You guys want to take a quick go at it, please?
Right. Yeah, I mean, for the softer skills, I think I think you have to evaluate, who is going to, handle that part of the interview. And I don't know if that really changes. I'd say it's probably on a company by company basis. Maybe at some of these other companies, they weren't too worried about the softer skills. Maybe that's why these people got through. But that being said, with AI, you could have it completely, whether or not you're not going to be able be able to have it change what people see face to face quite yet. But I mean, in terms of like correspondence that's written via email or, you know, text-based correspondence, you know, you can make it have a different sentiment than if you normally would. So if you tend to be a more abrasive person, then you could, you know, have ChatGPT rewrite it to be, you know, a little bit, add a little kindness to it. But yeah, yeah, I don't know. I think that's a difficult one. I think it goes back to, you know, similar to what we were talking about with engineering skills is just being able to get a feel for the person. And I know you've talked about using AI to kind of get a sentiment analysis but you know, at the same time, I think about, you know, when I've encountered those issues during an interview, and I didn't necessarily, I don't know, sometimes I think a lot of people have a lot going on in their lives. And and maybe it needs to be multiple rounds of interviews to really pick up on that, you know, those behavioral tones or whatever. Because you know, if somebody was, you know, I don't know, something could have happened I think we just need to put context around it, I guess, in order to understand what, you know, some of the behavioral things that you're seeing are. Because I think when you put context around it, then you're able to kind of make sense of it.
Well, my personal thoughts on this is, anyways, the whole tones and you know, facial expression analysis is something which is not the best, because we have ourselves seen that it can actually adversely impact people with you know, like neurodiverse or with some disabilities. So I don't really think that that's something. But what I was more alluding towards, and you know, the question is still open to Josie and Avinash as well, is talking about the ability to bring out the right kind of behavioral attributes within an interview. Like, you just don't go throw a problem at the candidate, look at, you know, what they responded, and then fill feedback and just get out. It's how to bring those aspects out that you really want to evaluate. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, you know, AI could certainly help you craft some of those questions based on
sort of go at it on how AI can really help in those kind of aspects and helping interviewers bring those aspects out.
Right. And so I wonder if, you know, one of the thoughts I just had was, could you get real-time information from AI that would suggest you ask certain questions? But
sorry, I can't hear you, Quentin.
Oh, you can't hear me.
Oh, I can hear him.
Yeah,
it might be you, Manav. Yeah. Can you hear
Manav,
any of
can you
us?
hear us?
I think he might not.
I think
be
Manav is not able to hear us.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Manav.
I lost the audio for some time there.
Yes.
So if you guys can repeat, please.
But I think going back to your question, you know, what's interesting is the robots that, you know, come and attend meetings now and then, you know, transcribe everything. But I mean, I suppose you could just have a robot in the room with you as like a counterpart for the interview, and, you know, ask questions as it detects certain things that are relevant to the interview. So I don't know. I think
that sounds interesting. A robot either, you know, asking the questions or even suggesting the questions. Why not?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
True. Interesting.
Actually, we can also have some guidelines on what to hear for in the answers. And because what happens is, during interview, many times you miss those fine things that are very interesting if you see them as signals. At least you should weigh on those signals, and decision will obviously vary contextual according to you. But you miss those signals many times when you go to feedback after some time. So
Right.
if we can provide some listening, attributes for the interviews, and it can pick those things and then provide those signals while I'm filling the feedback, that can really help me to as a reminder of, oh yeah, I missed that signal, or that signal was very interesting and I could have used it more.
Especially in the context of soft skills, I guess.
Yeah, context of hard skills as well. For example, I was using BarRaiser some time back, and I was talking to a candidate, and she told me that she developed a very interesting tool for their own team to develop faster and find some kind of errors that they were looking for. And while it was a very short discussion, and I could have clearly missed it, but if AI can, while when I'm putting notes, that it can align that with some of the values that we have as a team. For example, helping teams to improve efficiency of the whole team, that can quickly create a green signal for me, for the candidate, and help me maybe talk to the candidate more about it in further rounds of the interview as well.
Interesting. Josie?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think you touched on this. You have to be careful, especially in trying to use AI to assess soft skills. Folks who are neurodivergent are going to appear different ways, and again, it depends on the data sets you've been trained on, right? Because women, it can be considered aggressive, where a man speaking the same way will be considered assertive, right? So I think there's a very fine line that we need to play here. But I think where AI could be very useful is looking for consistency, for example, across different interviews, and how a candidate is responding to potentially one interviewer or another. If a red flag is raised, can the questions that going back to the robot in the chat with you, can it propose like, oh hey, maybe you want to dig into this line of questioning based off of the first 3 interviews, like these are areas that I still feel like should be assessed, right? And so I think, again, leveraging it to assist in the interview process, and then really obviously having the humans making the ultimate decisions is the important part here.
Interesting. So would you guys, what I hear is that all 3 of you all on the table are pretty open to having bots or assistants during the interview helping out, because I've heard apprehensions about that also sometimes, but that's great to know. Josie, coming back to bias, right? I really wanted to discuss that as well, right? So it's well known that AI is biased, because obviously the data that is there to train it is typically biased as well. But one thing that Gen AI is also able to do is extraction of context from a particular conversation, which can, and this is a school of thought that can also be used to eliminate those bias, right? So for example, let me talk about, you spoke something about job descriptions being more inclusive. Similarly, we can talk about the feedback being more inclusive. You mentioned about recency bias. So something that gives you visibility of the entire conversation and make sure that you're also able to remember the first 10 minutes as well as the last 10 minutes, or maybe neutralize the conversation through notes. You can eliminate gender, you can probably eliminate aspects which are about neurodiversity or a disability and so on. So do you think that could actually help in eliminate bias? Because I've seen divided thoughts on this particular aspect.
Yeah. So I completely agree, right? I think, yes, there is bias in the underlying data sets. And so the way you use AI, you need to be very careful, but very much so. It can also help with reducing bias too, but because it can look at the answers and see, okay, am I actually evaluating this person based on the answers that were given, not just because like, oh, hey, as an interviewer, we both grew up in the same town, and so my likability bias came in the first like 5 minutes of the meeting, and then I didn't really pay as much attention, right? Like all of these unconscious biases that we have come into play as humans. And so while I think we need to be careful to look at how we're using the AIs for evaluation, I also 100% agree that when used well, it can also help reduce bias. But again, I think this is where that double checking has to come in and look at like, okay, because it goes back to the earlier example I was giving, the AI can look across the different interviews, right? And so let's say you notice that, one interviewer is always giving more negative feedback or more crucial, difficult feedback to like women or people from different underrepresented minorities, right? You can actually like have that data be looked at over even different interviews, which you don't, and so it can actually even help with interview training for the different interviewers to see like, hey, how are these folks ranking people, and like where are biases potentially even coming into play, not just in one specific interview, but into helping train your interview pool too, or interviewer pool. So I think there are definite ways it can be used. It's just we need to be double checking and ensuring that we're not just trusting the AI and we're validating the results that we're getting. But absolutely, I think it could really help analyze things.
Interesting. And then not a lot of companies are thinking this way or maybe implementing something like this. To that point, Quentin, I also wanted to check with you on, when you recruit or your team recruits, what elements of interview or training to go into that, especially to address bias problems? Do you, is the team actively seeking diversity, or is it more of a function of top of the funnel? And then what do they do when they actively seek it, especially during the interviews or evaluations?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I haven't seen a team that really was actively seeking diversity. It was always about the skill set and just the behavior of the person. And so it always boiled down to, do we think this person can come in and do the job? And obviously they're very talented, and here's the skills they have, and that's primarily been the driving factor. But I think one thing about the biases piece is yes, it exists in tech, but I also think it's a bigger societal problem too. And not that we want to go down that rabbit hole here, but how do we get more people to get tech degrees, like because I think tech is like huge in terms of like being able to lift people out of poverty, and to actually move people across from like like lower class to like upper and middle and upper classes, and I'm one of those people, and so I'm a huge proponent of if you grew up in an impoverished neighborhood, that technology can help, can improve your lives tremendously. But yeah, so I think I just don't. And going back to the whether or not we let AI make the decision, one of the things one of the problems we had in the financial industry, and why you couldn't use AI for like portfolio recommendations or stock picks or whatever, is that you couldn't track how that decision was, how that decision came to, and there was no like audible trail. And during the interview process, I think that would be something that a lot of companies would be interested in, is like, can AI give me information on why this candidate was selected versus another candidate, and then you can, then you have something to analyze and look at and really determine if bias, came into play with the selection process. But yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answered your question. But...
No, it does. And I like, Avinash to also talk about some of his experiences with creating or I don't know if that's the right word, but enforcing bias or trying to actively seek it.
Right. And yeah, and that's, it's hard. It's a hard,
It is.
I think, because I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I guess I really don't have an answer there, but because you want to weight everything, fairly and
Correct.
but like Josie said, you even in in-person interviews, there's immense bias, and it may not even be like it may not even be the color of your skin or something. You
Correct.
may touch upon like similar interests and so you may eliminate bias in one area, but you may get it in another area. So
correct.
yeah.
Interesting. I also wanted to touch base a little bit about how much in the industry today are we able to go back and check that, hey, I hired X a year back and Mr. X is not performing well. Could there be a problem in my evaluation process? And how do we rectify it? Like, do people even do that in the context of tech hiring? Have you done it in the past? And I'm sure there are bad hires or mishires all the time. What typically ends up becoming a remediation for those?
I mean, from my experience, yes, there is some of that, but I wouldn't. And it depends on the size of an organization. And so, one of the things is I don't know if there's a feedback loop from HR back to, engineering teams, but it would have been nice. But oftentimes you would have, say for instance at IHS Market, you would have, a number of engineers that would be out of a pool of engineers that are have agreed to do interviews or whatever, and then they would go and do interviews and meet the candidate and go through the process or whatever, and then often those people that you hire would get put on some team that you don't really interact with, and it works in another part of the building or in a different building, and so I do think there needs to be that feedback loop to understand if your process is working. I think typically we only modified our process whenever it was hard, whenever it became cumbersome. So you can imagine doing remote coding interviews or whatever, and if somebody can easily access the material that you want them to interact with, then that's typically where you would modify things. But I mean, what's funny is from a lot of technologists are more concentrated on the technology itself rather than the process itself, and so I often felt there was emphasis on, okay, the technology's changed, we need to alter our questions, or it's too hard to access the material or whatever. I think very rarely was it ever changed because somebody came back from HR or you found out somebody was let go because of it. But I think that's a great point. Like people should change their process based on
because especially every mishire it's just crazy expensive, right? So it costs a lot of money.
Right.
Josie, in your experience, have you seen the feedback loop like this, or what is like, are companies designing their process more as a reaction to the market forces, as Quentin was talking about, right? Like if it's becoming cumbersome, which is basically a reaction to that, whether we are able to roll out offers quickly enough or not. Vis-a-vis, is our process a good indication of someone's on the job performance?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think bigger companies do sometimes look at that for those things, but I think especially in like the startup world, like I don't think I've ever seen anybody kind of looking back and saying like, hey, should we change the interview process, right? And it really tends to just be like, okay, unless there's a role that you tend to hire for on an ongoing regular basis, it's almost like, okay, I now have a need for a back-end Java developer. Let us go, like, and maybe we can pull from the last time we did this interview loop, but let's just base it off of that. I do see very little of, and I mean, sometimes there is a little bit of reevaluation, like, and thinking of like, okay, where are areas where we might have potentially wanted to do it, but I don't see it being an intentional activity that is happening.
Okay. And you mentioned something about, a comparison of large organizations versus relatively startups. So Avinash sort of comes entirely, or a very large, very big startup background. Avinash, have you seen something like this happening? Uh, and maybe there's no system or a formal process to it, but people talking about it, especially hiring managers and recruiters or HR teams as well as tech teams together.
So I have not seen this in technology teams, but I've seen in teams where there is large amount of hiring, and there I've seen them doing this cohort analysis of, we got this cohort together and how did they perform versus other cohorts, and whether they have missed on few things that they could improve on the interviewing process. Also from the feedback forms. So one of the companies that I've been talking to, about how they have built this process. So what they do is they analyze their feedback forms at the end of, for the new hires for every quarter, half yearly, and now they have a continuous feedback also. And then they see if there is any one theme emerging out. So say suppose they see, attention to details is not there or follow-ups are not good. So I've seen more in sales team I've been talking about. And so everybody do follow-ups, etc. And then they try to incorporate that in the interviewing process to then improve it and then check in next quarter if that gets better or not. But not so much on tech.
And why is that? Is this like, why not tech? I'm just curious to sort of explore. Is it something that is not really relevant out there, or?
I think one of the problems with technology teams is it for sales teams it gets very easy to understand if someone is right fit or not, or if someone is performing or not very quickly.
Okay.
Because there are direct numbers and you can see the quota meeting, etc. But for technology team, it takes time, and then there are a lot of other factors can also influence it. What kind of project you was on, what kind of team you was on, and then your manager and all of those things also affect your performance. So it gets difficult to map performance directly with the hiring process or the start of the funnel. I think that may be the reason.
And maybe AI can help with some of those analysis as well. Honestly,
Yeah,
we've been
actually,
talking about it quite a lot.
because when data is parsed, it gets a bigger exercise to be able to do that.
Correct.
And somehow people not get into that exercise. But yes, obviously if AI can help us mine that data very quickly, then that can become an easy loop to then execute with every feedback.
Interesting. Well, that's most of the questions that I had. In fact, everything. Do you guys have any closing points?
No, but I think going back to what you just commented on, I think performance reviews, you could potentially, if you wanted that feedback loop and AI was going to be involved, then and maybe there's something that could be done there. But because I mean, at the end of the day, you just whether or not it would be completely automated, I don't know. But I think, you know, many organizations are dysfunctional and evaluate performance of not candidates, but current employees for all the wrong reasons. Like, you know, at a number of places I worked, it wasn't uncommon for, you know, the people that are firefighting to get the most recognition. And, you know, as an organization, you don't really want to be in firefighting mode very often. And so, so I think, you know, in terms of performance evaluation, it really probably depends on the organization. But
that's very valid, actually. Thank you.
But yeah, I don't know. Final points. I don't know. How you know, one of the things I've been thinking about is you know, BarRaiser's implementing AI, and could it actually be disrupted by AI in the long term? Like, things are moving so fast that
That's
it's
true.
like, what product do you develop?
Absolutely.
And so I'm keep thinking in my head, I'm like, man, any new organization that comes out using AI, it could also be disrupted tomorrow. Not
Absolutely.
only, you know, legacy, but new. So it's like break out the popcorn and sit on the couch and
And watch the show.
see
Yeah.
what happens. But
I think we're already going to
Interesting
be seeing
times.
that in January when the ChatGPT store releases, right? All of these wrappers that have been released in the last like year that are basically just very lightweight wrappers around ChatGPT are all going to potentially be replaced by entries in the GPT store that anybody can easily create. So I think come January when they release the GPT store, it's going to be a fascinating world to see what happens in the first few months of next year. But I mean, I think actually though, to BarRaiser's credit, it's what you're building is not just a wrapper, right? And I think the companies that at least at the beginning are going to kind of fail, in my humble opinion, are definitely the ones that are more just like wrappers around ChatGPT. I think the fact that BarRaiser is really trying to look at it as like assisting folks through the process, and then can really dig into like, hey, how could we analyze things across interviews, right? How could we potentially leverage this? Like, I love Quentin's point about, you know, the same bias that shows up in our interview process very much shows up in our performance review process, right? Like, I could talk about that for hours. And I mean, it's almost the same analysis that you could potentially be doing on that data and really help folks feel like, okay, here's how we actually are reducing bias and actually giving more effective and constructive feedback, especially if you can look at like more inputs along the way, right? And I think my big final point is like I said earlier, I think what a software engineer is going to be doing in 5 years is going to look totally different than what a software engineer does today. And it's really going to be the folks that are going to succeed. And I'm not saying like software engineer jobs are going to disappear. I think it's about being willing to learn and evolve. I mean, this is not the first time we've gone through a major, you know, technology evolution, right? Software engineers back in the day used to write on punch cards, and we certainly don't do that anymore, but we still have obviously tons of need for engineers. And so I think it's all about learning and evolving and kind of just being open to what's out there.
Cool, awesome. I loved it, guys. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you. And yeah, have a good rest of the day. And there are a lot of interesting thoughts that come to mind after this discussion, both in terms of AI, tech recruitment, even BarRaiser's future, right? So that's quite interesting. Thank you so much. You guys have a good rest of the day and week. And
awesome.
yeah, let's catch up soon again.
Yeah. Thanks, Manav.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care, Josie.